The world dissolved into a strobing chaos of red and blue in her rearview mirror. For a heartbeat, Aria Thompson didn't react. Her knuckles, wrapped around the leather steering wheel of her Acura, were pale. Outside, the manicured lawns of Summit Ridge slept under a blanket of pre-dawn mist. The Tudor-style mansions, with their dark, watchful windows, stood like silent judges. There were no other cars, no witnesses, just her, the road, and the insistent, silent pulse of authority closing in behind her. A familiar cold knot tightened in her stomach, but she pushed it down, replacing it with the icy calm she reserved for the courtroom. She signaled, pulled the car over to the curb with a smooth, deliberate motion, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the soft tick of her turn signal and the thrumming of her own heart. She did a mental checklist. Speed? 5 miles under the limit. Stop sign? A full 3-second stop. Phone? In her purse, on silent. There was no reason. And in places like Summit Ridge, no reason was always the most dangerous reason of all. The crunch of boots on asphalt approached the driver's side. Aria kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, visible and still. A shape materialized in her side window, blocking the nascent morning light. The officer was tall, with the broad-shouldered confidence of a man who had never been questioned. His name tag read, Miller. He tapped the glass with a gloved knuckle. A sharp, impatient sound. Aria powered the window down. The crisp, cold air that swept in was a shock to her system, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, the metallic tang of scrutiny. "Good morning," Officer Miller said. The words were a courtesy, his tone was not. His eyes, shaded by aviator sunglasses despite the dim light, did a slow, methodical sweep of her face, her hair, her professional but simple attire. "License and registration, please." She reached for her purse on the passenger seat, her movements slow and telegraphed. "Of course, officer." She handed him the documents. Her hand was steady. Her gaze was level. Inside, her mind was already building a case, noting the lack of a stated reason for the stop, a potential Fourth Amendment violation. He took them, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second too long. He barely glanced at the ID before his eyes were back on her. "Aria Thompson," he read aloud, a slight inflection on her name that made it sound foreign in his mouth. "What brings you to Summit Ridge this early?" It wasn't a question about a traffic violation. It was an interrogation of her very presence. "I'm on my way to work," she said, her voice even. He leaned against the doorframe, making the space feel smaller, more claustrophobic. "Work, huh? This isn't your usual thoroughfare. Most folks use the interstate. Unusual thoroughfare. Unfamiliar cars." The coded language was as old as the roads themselves. It meant you don't belong here. The interstate had an accident reported. "My GPS rerouted me," she lied smoothly. It was a plausible defense, a shield against the unspoken accusation. Miller didn't seem to buy it, or perhaps he didn't care. His gaze drifted past her to the briefcase and laptop bag on the passenger seat. "And where is work, Miss Thompson?" She hesitated. Telling him she was an assistant U.S. attorney headed to the federal courthouse felt like an escalation, a card she wasn't ready to play. It could be seen as a threat or, worse, an admission of a status she shouldn't have to use as a shield. Out here, she wasn't a USA Thompson. She was just a woman in the wrong zip code at the wrong time. "Downtown," she replied simply. A faint, knowing smirk touched the corner of his lips. "Right. Lot of important business downtown." He straightened up, holding her license like a playing card he was about to slap on a table. "You know, we've had a string of break-ins in the area. Early morning, people casing houses." "I'm sure you have," Aria said, meeting his unseen eyes in the reflection of his sunglasses. "Am I suspected of casing houses, officer?" The question was direct, stripped of politeness. It was a legal query, and it shifted the ground beneath them. Miller's jaw tightened. The folks he usually stopped here either dissolved into apologies or erupted in anger. They didn't parry with quiet, clinical precision. Just being thorough, he clipped out. "Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? Just a quick peek. It'll only take a second." There it was, the pivot. The casual request that was anything but. It was a test of compliance, a measure of how far he could push before she broke. Her entire career was built on knowing the law, on wielding it. The answer was already on her lips before he finished the sentence. "With all due respect, officer," she said, her voice dropping a register, gaining a hard, polished edge. "You haven't stated a probable cause for this stop. let alone for a search. So, no, I do not consent. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Miller stood perfectly still, his posture radiating a mix of surprise and annoyance. He had expected fear or indignation, not a calm, legal refusal. For a long moment, she thought he would escalate, order her out of the car, call for backup, invent a reason. She could see the calculations flickering behind the mirrored lenses. Instead, he took a step back from the car. The spell was broken. "All right," he said. The word clipped. He handed her license and registration back through the window. "Drive safe, Miss Thompson, and maybe stick to the main roads next time." It was a parting shot, a final assertion of control. Arya took her documents, placed them back in her purse, and said nothing. She didn't thank him. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She rolled up her window, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the curb, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. She drove slowly, deliberately, not giving him the satisfaction of a panicked exit. She watched as his patrol car remained parked for a few moments before it too pulled away and turned down a side street, disappearing into the mist. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. The adrenaline left a bitter taste in her mouth. She drove for another mile before the shaking started in her hands. It wasn't fear, it was rage. A cold, focused rage that she had learned to channel into fuel. She pulled over again, this time on a busy commercial street that felt like another universe compared to the oppressive quiet of Summit Ridge. Her dash cam, a discreet cylinder mounted behind her rearview mirror, had been recording the entire time. Standard practice for her, a habit born from necessity. But something else nagged at her, a detail she had caught just as Miller's patrol car was turning. She picked up her phone, her fingers still trembling slightly, and zoomed in on a photo she had instinctively snapped through her side mirror as he'd paused at the corner. The morning sun, just beginning to break through the clouds, had glinted off his windshield. And there, stuck to the inside of the glass in the lower right corner, was a small decal. It wasn't a police union sticker or a city permit. It was something else entirely. A stylized golden scale, intricately designed, but it was unbalanced. One side of the scale was weighed down, not by a rock or a weight, but by a serpent, its body coiled tightly around the arm, its fanged mouth open as if in a silent scream. Arya stared at the image, a chill crawling up her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was a symbol she had seen once before, buried deep in a confidential file, on a photo taken at a crime scene. A crime scene connected to the very case that was consuming her life. Operation Midas. The traffic stop wasn't random. It wasn't about her presence in an affluent neighborhood. It was a message, and Officer Miller was the messenger. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the U.S. Attorney's Office felt a world away from the misty tensions of Summit Ridge. The air here smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and the quiet desperation of 1,000 pending cases. Arya sat across from her boss, David Chen, in his glass-walled office overlooking the bustling city below. The photo of the serpent and scale decal was displayed on her tablet, stark against the polished mahogany of his desk. David, a man whose weary eyes and perpetually loosened tie spoke of a long, bruising career, leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. He listened patiently, as Arya recounted the traffic stop, his expression unreadable. "So, a cop with a chip on his shoulder pulled you over," he said when she finished, his voice flat. "Arya, this happens. It's infuriating, it's wrong, but it happens. We've got bigger fish to fry. The Midas indictment is due in 3 weeks. David, look at the decal," she insisted, pushing the tablet closer. "This isn't just a chip on his shoulder. This is the same symbol we found painted on the warehouse floor where Midas was laundering cash. The one the analysts couldn't identify." He squinted at the image, a flicker of something interest, annoyance, crossing his face. "It's similar. It could be a coincidence. Some kind of fringe group, a sovereign citizen thing. These guys love their weird symbols. On a police cruiser, in the exact neighborhood we suspect is their financial hub? That's not a coincidence. It's a connection," Arya argued, her frustration mounting. The dismissal felt like a deliberate blind spot. "I think this Officer Miller is dirty. I think he's on their payroll." David sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of bureaucratic inertia. He picked up a pen and began tapping it on a legal pad. "And what do you want to do? Launch a full-scale corruption probe based on a traffic stop and a sticker? The brass at the 12th precinct will laugh us out of the room. They'll claim harassment. It'll compromise the entire Midas investigation if they think we're on a witch hunt." I'm not asking for a probe, Arya countered, reining in her tone. I'm asking for permission to pull his file, discreetly. Just a look. Let me see his service record, his financials. Let me run his name through the DEA and FBI databases, cross-reference him with known Midas associates. He was silent for a long time, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the pen, the only sound in the room. He looked out the window, at the monolithic towers of finance and law that dominated the skyline. The Midas case is my legacy, Arya. It's the biggest bust this office has seen in a decade. I can't have it derailed by a side quest, no matter how righteous you feel. This isn't a side quest, she said, her voice low but firm. It's part of the main quest. If they have law enforcement in their pocket, our entire case could be built on sand. Our witnesses, our evidence, it could all be compromised. Finally, he stopped tapping. He slid the tablet back to her. Fine, but you do it on your own time. No official resources tied to this office until you bring me something concrete. Something more than a gut feeling and a picture. And you keep it firewalled from Midas. Understood? Understood, she said, gathering her things. It wasn't the full-throated support she'd hoped for, but it was a green light. That was enough. Back at her own cramped, paper-strewn desk, Arya felt a surge of defiant energy. The first call she made was not to an official database, but to an old law school friend, Ben Carter, now a defense attorney who knew the city's underbelly better than anyone. Mark Miller, 12th Precinct? Ben's voice crackled over the phone. Yeah, I know the name. Clean as a whistle. Too clean. He's one of those guys who never seems to be in the wrong place. Makes you wonder if he's just lucky, or if he's very, very good at making sure he's always in the right place. What does that mean? Arya asked. It means he's the precinct's golden boy. High arrest numbers, no civilian complaints that have ever stuck. Every time a complaint is filed, the witness recants, or the evidence mysteriously disappears. He's Teflon. Why are you asking? Just a name that crossed my desk. Arya lied. Thanks, Ben. The too clean profile was a massive red flag. In her line of work, perfection was often the best disguise for corruption. She hung up and turned to her computer. Using a secure login that gave her access to interagency records, she pulled up Officer Mark Miller's official file. Just as Ben had said, it was immaculate. Commendations for bravery, glowing performance reviews, a steady but unremarkable career path. His financial disclosures were equally boring. A modest mortgage on a house in a middle-class suburb, a car loan, some credit card debt. Nothing that screamed dirty money. But Arya knew where to look. It wasn't in the official documents. It was in the gaps between them. She cross-referenced his patrol logs with the known dates of Midas's high-volume money drops dates they'd gotten from a low-level informant. For hours, she stared at spreadsheets and GPS data, her eyes burning. At first, nothing. Miller's patrol car was never logged near the drop locations. Then she saw it, a pattern, subtle but undeniable. On every single one of the 5 confirmed Midas drop nights, Officer Miller's patrol car had gone dark for a period ranging from 20 to 45 minutes. The official reason was always the same: equipment malfunction, radio, GPS. In a department with aging tech, it was a plausible excuse. Once or twice, it was believable. 5 times, all coinciding with major criminal activity? That was a statistical impossibility. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the concrete evidence David had asked for. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she drafted a new encrypted email. But before she could send it, a notification popped up on her screen. It was an alert from the system's security protocol, something she'd set up after a previous case had been compromised. Unauthorized access attempt detected on file Midas Master Indictment. Originating terminal, Chen, David. The alert was time-stamped just 2 minutes after she had left his office. Arya froze, her blood turning to ice. David hadn't just been looking at the Midas file. The system logged the specific queries. He had run a search. The search term was Arya Thompson, current vehicle, plate number. He wasn't just dismissing her concerns. He was checking up on her. He had accessed her personal information right after she told him she'd been stopped. Why? To verify her story? Or for some other reason? An icy wave of paranoia washed over her. She minimized the window, her mind racing. Was David just being a cautious, overbearing boss? Or was his reluctance to investigate Miller something more sinister? Just then, her encrypted messaging app chimed, with a sound she rarely heard. It was reserved for high priority, anonymous tips. She opened it. The sender was an untraceable proxy. The message was a single, chilling sentence. They know who you are. The stop wasn't a warning. It was a test. And you failed. The anonymous message burned on Arya's screen, a digital brand searing itself into her thoughts. You failed. What test? The test of her compliance? Her fear? Or had she failed by not backing down, by signaling that she was a threat? The ambiguity was a weapon in itself, designed to sow chaos in her mind. She pushed away from her desk, the quiet hum of her office suddenly feeling suffocating. The revelation about the decal, Miller's suspicious patrol logs, and now this cryptic warning, they weren't just separate threads. They were strands of the same venomous web, and she had just stumbled right into the middle of it. Summit Ridge wasn't just a wealthy suburb, it was a hunting ground. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. Miller hadn't been on a random patrol. He was a sentinel, a guard dog for the Midas organization. His job was to monitor the streets, to stop anyone who didn't fit the pristine, insulated profile of the neighborhood. The traffic stop wasn't a warning, it was an interrogation. They were probing her, trying to figure out if her presence was a coincidence or if law enforcement was finally closing in on their financial nerve center. Her refusal to be intimidated had given them an answer. The scope of the problem expanded exponentially in her mind. This was no longer about a single dirty cop. It was about systemic rot. If Midas had one officer on their payroll, they likely had more. They had an intelligence network operating within the very system trying to take them down. She took a deep breath, forcing the panic down. She couldn't trust David, not after he'd run her plates, not after his dismissive attitude. But she couldn't proceed alone either. She needed to present her findings in a way that he couldn't ignore, forcing his hand without revealing her suspicion of him. She spent the next hour meticulously compiling her findings into a single, undeniable report. She wove together the photo of the decal, the cross-referenced patrol logs showing Miller's GPS blackouts, and the statistical anomaly of it all. She left out the anonymous message and David's search of her information. Those were cards she had to hold close. She framed the report not as an accusation, but as a critical security risk to the Midas investigation. Armed with her new evidence, she walked back to David's office. She didn't knock. She walked straight in, placing the printed report firmly on his desk. "This is more than a gut feeling," she said, her voice devoid of the pleading from their earlier conversation. It was now cold, hard fact. David leaned forward, reading the document. The air in the room grew heavy as his eyes moved down the page. The faint tapping of his pen was absent now. When he looked up, the weariness in his face had been replaced by a sharp, focused intensity she hadn't seen before. 5 times, he said, his voice a low murmur. His GPS went down 5 times on Midas drop nights. The odds of that being a coincidence are astronomical, Arya stated. He's dirty, David, and his precinct is their territory. We have a breach. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. He seemed to be wrestling with a decision far heavier than just a corruption probe. This changes everything. It means they're not just watching us, they're inside. He turned back to face her, his expression grim. All right, you were right. We need to open a formal inquiry, but we have to be smart about this. We can't go through the usual channels. We can't trust the 12th precinct, and we can't risk tipping off anyone else who might be on their payroll. He paused, running a hand over his face. I'm going to make a call. To the OPR, he said, referring to the Office of Professional Responsibility, the FBI's internal affairs. I'll request a dedicated agent to be assigned to you, someone from outside this district, someone with no local ties. Arya felt a small, cautious surge of relief. This was the right move. It insulated the investigation, bringing in a trusted outsider. Who? I have someone in mind, David said vaguely, already reaching for his desk phone. An old-timer. Thorough. Cautious. You won't like him, but you can trust him. His name is Frank Russo. In the meantime, you are to speak to no one about this. Not Ben Carter, not your contacts. No one. Is that clear? Crystal, Arya said, a sense of momentum finally building. She walked out of his office feeling like she had just won a major battle. She had forced the system to act. The wheels of justice, slow and cumbersome as they were beginning to turn. That feeling lasted until she got back to her apartment that night. The building was old but secure, with a doorman and keycard elevators. But as she unlocked her front door, she felt it instantly. A subtle shift in the air, a wrongness. She drew the small can of pepper spray she carried in her purse, her heart pounding. She eased the door open. The living room was dark, but a sliver of moonlight from the window illuminated the scene. Nothing was broken. Nothing was obviously out of place. But her briefcase, which she had left on the coffee table, was now open. The files inside, printouts of witness statements, and financial reports from the Midas case, were slightly askew, as if they had been handled and put back in a hurry. Her blood ran cold. They had been in her home. They hadn't taken anything. They had read everything. It was a violation far more profound than theft. It was an invasion of her mind, of her work. She backed out of the apartment slowly, her hand shaking as she fumbled for her phone. She didn't call 911. What would she tell them? That her papers were messy? They would dismiss it. She called the one number David had told her not to. But as the phone rang, she knew it was a mistake. She hung up before anyone could answer. She was on her own until Russo arrived. Then, her personal phone buzzed. A new email had arrived in her inbox. The subject line was blank. The sender was an email address that was just a jumble of random letters and numbers. She opened it. There was no text, just a single attachment. It was a video file. With trembling hands, she downloaded and played it. The video was grainy, clearly filmed from a distance, with a powerful zoom lens. It showed the front of her apartment building. It showed her, just minutes ago, getting out of a taxi and walking inside. Then the camera panned up, zooming in on her own apartment window, dark against the night sky. The video held on the window for 10 long, agonizing seconds. Then, a new message popped up on her screen, from the same anonymous sender as before. This one was different. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was an instruction. The test is over. Now comes the lesson. Drop the Midas case, or the next video we send won't be of your empty apartment. Arya didn't sleep. The video of her apartment played on a loop in her mind, a silent, menacing film that underscored her new reality. The sanctity of her home had been shattered, replaced by the chilling awareness of being constantly watched. The threat wasn't just professional anymore. It was deeply personal. They hadn't just breached her office's firewalls. They had breached the walls of her life. The next morning, she met David in a sterile, soundproof conference room, the air thick with unspoken fear. She showed him the email, the video. His face, already etched with worry, seemed to age another decade. "They're escalating faster than I thought possible," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is beyond a few dirty cops. This is organized, disciplined. They want me off the Midas case," Arya said, her voice a tight wire. "They think I'm the weak link they can break." "And are you?" David asked, his gaze sharp, analytical. It wasn't a question of her courage, but of her strategy. "No," she replied, the single word carrying the weight of her defiance. "This just proves I'm on the right track. It proves that Miller and the Midas case are one and the same. We don't back down. We push harder." "I agree," David said, a new resolve hardening his features. "And you won't be alone. He's here." The conference room door opened, and a man stepped inside, who looked like he had been carved from granite and cynicism. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a weathered face, a cheap, rumpled suit, and eyes that missed nothing. He carried a worn leather briefcase and moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had seen it all and been impressed by none of it. "Arya Thompson, this is Special Agent Frank Russo," David said. "Frank, this is the AUSA I told you about." Russo's handshake was firm, brief, and dry. He didn't smile. His eyes did a quick, professional assessment of Arya, and she could feel him cataloging her young, ambitious, probably in over her head. "So," Russo began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sounded like it was filtered through cheap whiskey and too many cigarettes. "You managed to poke a hornet's nest in your first week on the job. Impressive." The condescension was immediate and intentional. "I uncovered a critical vulnerability in a federal investigation, Agent Russo," Arya corrected him coolly. "I thought the FBI would be grateful." A hint of a smirk played on Russo's lips. "Gratitude doesn't close cases, counselor. Evidence does. Let's see what you've got." For the next hour, they laid it all out for him. The stop, the decal, the patrol logs, the break-in, the video threat. Russo listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. He didn't take notes. He just absorbed it, his gaze fixed on the file in front of him. When they were done, He leaned back in his chair. The precinct you're looking at, the 12th, is a fortress. They protect their own. Going at them head-on is a rookie mistake. They'll circle the wagons, and every piece of evidence you need will vanish. So what's your plan? Arya challenged. Wait for them to make a mistake? No, Russo said, a glint in his tired eyes. We don't wait. We create an environment where they're forced to make a mistake. We need leverage from the inside. A whisper campaign. We let it be known through back channels that Internal Affairs is sniffing around the 12th, but we don't say why. We make everyone nervous. The clean cops will start watching the dirty ones. The dirty ones will get paranoid and sloppy. It was a classic, old-school tactic, built on psychological pressure rather than digital forensics. It was also brilliant. Their initial dynamic was one of friction and barely concealed conflict. Russo saw Arya as a by-the-book prosecutor who didn't understand the messy reality of the streets. Arya saw Russo as a jaded relic, a man who had perhaps lost his fire. But as they began to work, a grudging respect started to form. Russo's cynicism was a shield, but beneath it was a razor-sharp instinct for police work. He started by running deep background checks on not just Miller, but the 3 other officers who were consistently on his shift. Officially, their finances were as clean as Miller's. But Russo didn't stop there. He used FBI resources to pull property records, vehicle registrations, and business filings for their spouses, parents, and siblings. Cops this discipline don't put dirty money in their own name, Russo grunted, hunched over a laptop in the small, windowless office they'd been assigned. They get a cousin to open an LLC. They buy their mom a new car with cash. They pay for a sibling's beach house down payment. You follow the lifestyle, not the bank statement. 2 days later, they hit gold. Miller's partner, an officer named Henderson, had a brother who had, 6 months prior, purchased a high-performance speedboat worth over $100,000. He paid in cash. The brother's declared income as a high school gym teacher couldn't possibly account for it. At the same time, Russo ran the financials for the other 2 officers on the shift. One's wife had recently started a consulting business with no clients and no website, yet had deposited nearly $50,000 into its account. The other's father had paid off a 30-year mortgage 15 years early. Here's our network, Russo said, tapping the screen. 4 officers, all living beyond their means, all hiding it through family, all working the same shift in the same zone. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was damning. It was the foundation they needed to get warrants. It was proof that the corruption ran deeper than just one man. As they were documenting their findings, an encrypted notification pinged on Russo's secure FBI laptop. It was a flag from a financial crimes database. A transaction had just been triggered that matched a series of markers they had set up related to known Midas shell corporations. What is it? Arya asked, leaning over his shoulder. Russo's face was grim. It's a payment. A big one. Just transferred from a holding company we've linked to Midas. To who? He typed a few commands, and a name appeared on the screen. It wasn't one of the 4 officers. It wasn't a family member. It was a name Arya recognized instantly. Benjamin Carter, Russo read aloud, looking over at her. He's a defense attorney, and according to your visitor logs, you had a phone call with him 2 days ago. Arya felt the floor drop out from under her. Ben, her friend from law school. The one she had called for a simple background check on Miller. A payment of $250,000 had just landed in an offshore account linked to his name. He hadn't just given her information. He had sold her out. The name on the screen, Benjamin Carter, hung in the air between them, an indictment of Arya's judgment. A wave of nausea washed over her. It wasn't just a professional betrayal. It was the sickening realization that a friend, someone she had trusted for years, had sold her safety for $250,000. Her call to him wasn't an innocent inquiry. It was the trigger that had set everything in motion. The break-in, the video, the threats, it all traced back to that single, careless phone call. Russo watched her, his expression unreadable, but not unsympathetic. Friends are the first place they look, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. They test the perimeter. You gave them your perimeter. I know, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. The shame was a physical weight. All right, Russo said, his tone shifting back to business, sharp and decisive. Forget him, he's a symptom, not the disease. But this gives us an opening. Carter is their lawyer, their fixer. He's also our weak point. A lawyer taking a payoff that big? That's disbarment. That's prison time. He's vulnerable. You think he'll flip? Arya asked, her mind struggling to catch up. Everyone flips when the alternative is a 10 by 10 cell, Russo grunted. But we can't approach him directly. If he's a true believer, he'll warn his bosses. We need to find our own leverage first. Something they don't know we have. That's when Russo's old-school police work truly began to shine. He didn't focus on digital trails or financial records anymore. He focused on people. For 3 days, he disappeared into the city's labyrinth of smoky bars, union halls, and greasy spoon diners where cops congregated. He called in decades-old favors, speaking in the coded, nuanced language of cops, talking to cops. He wasn't an FBI agent investigating them. He was an old wolf sniffing the air, looking for the scent of fear. He found it in a young patrol officer from the 12th Precinct named Jimmy Riley. Riley was barely 25, with honest eyes and a posture that screamed anxiety. Russo cornered him not in an interrogation room, but over a lukewarm coffee at an all-night diner far from his precinct. "I'm not here about you, kid," Russo started, his voice disarmingly calm. "I'm here about the company you keep. I know Miller and his crew have been leaning on the new guys, making you look the other way, making you lose a memo or forget to log a stop. I'm telling you now, when this thing breaks, they're going to feed the rookies to the sharks to save themselves." Riley's hand trembled as he lifted his coffee cup. He didn't say a word, but his eyes darted towards the door, terrified. "I'm offering you a life raft," Russo continued, leaning in. "You don't have to testify. You don't have to wear a wire. Just give me something. Something tangible. A location. A schedule. Something to prove you chose the right side before it was too late." The kid broke. In a hushed, panicked voice, Riley told Russo about a ledger. It wasn't digital. It was an old-fashioned, leather-bound notebook. Miller was arrogant. He kept a detailed record of all their off-the-books, activities, payouts, guard duty schedules for Midas transports, names of contacts. He called it his insurance policy. He kept it locked in a file cabinet in the precinct's rarely used records annex in the basement. It was the break they needed. Getting into the annex, however, was another problem. It required a key and a code, both held by the shift supervisor. That night, Russo and Arya sat in a parked car a block away from the 12th Precinct, the building a blocky, imposing silhouette against the city lights. An unspoken tension had been replaced by a shared focus. "This is where it gets dangerous," Russo said, staring at the precinct. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. "Years ago, I had a partner. Best cop I ever knew. We were working a corruption case, just like this one. Inside job. We thought we had it all locked down, but we missed one guy. One of their guys on our team. They led us into an ambush." He paused, the memory clouding his eyes. "My partner didn't make it. I did. They called me a hero, gave me a medal, but I knew the truth. I'd been outmaneuvered. I learned that day that in this line of work, trust is a liability until it's been forged in fire." Arya finally understood. His cynicism wasn't apathy, it was armor. It was the scar tissue from a wound that had never fully healed. "I'm sorry, Frank," she said softly. He just nodded, the moment of vulnerability passing. "The point is, we go in smart, no mistakes." Their plan was simple, but audacious. They would create a diversion. Arya, using her authority as an AUSA, would call the precinct's front desk, reporting a fake bomb threat at a courthouse evidence locker 2 miles away, requesting the shift supervisor and all available units to respond immediately. It was a federal request that couldn't be ignored. While the precinct was in chaos, Riley, the rookie, would slip down to the annex, retrieve the ledger, and pass it to Russo, who would be waiting by a rear exit. The plan went into motion just after 2 a.m. The precinct exploded into a flurry of activity as Arya's call came in. Sirens blared as cars peeled out of the parking lot. In the confusion, Riley did his part. Minutes later, Russo's burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Riley. "Caught it. Back door. Now." Russo was out of the car in a flash. Arya watched, her heart pounding, as he melted into the shadows near the rear of the building. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, he was back, sliding into the driver's seat. In his hand was a worn, black leather notebook. He didn't say a word. He just started the car and drove. They didn't stop until they were miles away, parked under a flickering street lamp in an industrial park. Russo opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Miller's neat, precise handwriting. It was all there. Dates, times, locations, and cash amounts that lined up perfectly with their Midas intel. It was a prosecutor's dream. It was the nail in their coffin. Arya scanned the pages, her excitement growing. "This is it, Frank. This is everything." "Not everything," Russo said, his voice grim. He pointed to a page near the back. The top half of the page was filled with names, cops, city officials, contacts. But the bottom half of the page had been crudely torn out, leaving a jagged edge. "What was on that part?" Arya asked, a new sense of dread creeping in. "Riley said he saw Miller tear it out a week ago," Russo replied, his eyes dark. "He said he only got a quick glance at it before it was gone." "What did he see?" Russo looked at her, and the weight of his earlier story about his partner settled back into the car. He said it wasn't just another cop's name. He said it was a list. And at the top of that list was the name of a federal judge. The words "federal judge" sucked all the air out of the car. The scope of the conspiracy had just metastasized, growing from a corrupt police precinct into the hallowed halls of the judiciary itself. This wasn't just about dirty cops protecting a drug ring anymore. This was a cancer that had invaded the very heart of the justice system. A compromised judge meant compromised warrants, tainted trials, and a level of protection for the Midas organization that was nearly absolute. "Which judge?" Arya asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Riley didn't get the name," Russo said, snapping the ledger shut as if its contents were radioactive. "He just saw the title. But it doesn't matter. Any judge on their payroll means our case is dead before it even reaches a courtroom. We have to assume the worst." The ledger, as powerful as it was now a double-edged sword. It was their best piece of evidence, but it was also incomplete. The missing piece of that page was the key to blowing the whole thing open. Back in their secure office, they huddled over the notebook. They now had names, dates, and direct financial ties between Miller's crew and Midas. It was enough to get warrants for the officers, but Arya knew it wasn't enough to take down the whole network. They needed to catch them in the act, to link the street-level corruption to the higher echelons of power. "The ledger mentions a monthly collection day," Arya pointed out, tracing a finger over Miller's precise script. "It's a cash pickup. The next one is in 2 days, at a container storage facility by the docks. This is our chance." Russo was skeptical. It could be a trap. "After your break-in, they know someone is digging. They might be waiting for us." "It's a risk we have to take," Arya insisted. "This is a direct transaction between Miller's crew and a Midas lieutenant. If we can get surveillance on that exchange, we get undeniable proof. We can leverage that against Miller to get the judge's name." Their plan was meticulous and built on the element of surprise. They wouldn't use local FBI or police. Russo, through David Chen, requisitioned a small, elite surveillance team from the FBI's Quantico headquarters agents with no connection to the city. They would set up long-range audio and video surveillance at the storage facility. Arya and Russo would be in a mobile command van a half-mile away, monitoring the feed. No one would move in until the cash and the Midas lieutenant were both inside Miller's vehicle. The night of the stakeout was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel from the nearby port. From their van, the grainy, black and white video feed showed the desolate rows of shipping containers. The tension was a living thing in the small space. At precisely 11 p.m., a dark sedan pulled up. Miller and his partner, Henderson, got out, their body language tense and watchful. A few minutes later, another car arrived. A known Midas enforcer stepped out, carrying a heavy duffel bag. "We're on," Russo said into his mic, his voice a low command. "All teams, hold positions. Wait for the handoff." On the screen, the Midas enforcer handed the bag to Miller, who opened it to check the contents. It was perfect. They had them. "Okay," Arya said, her heart pounding. "The money has been exchanged. It's time. All teams, move in." Before she could finish the sentence, the world on their screens erupted into chaos. From the shadows between the containers, 2 more vehicles without lights screeched into the scene, blocking all exits. Men in dark tactical gear, armed with automatic weapons, swarmed out. "Who the hell are they?" one of the Quantico agents yelled over the comms. "They're not our guys." It was an ambush. But they weren't targeting Miller. They were targeting the FBI positions. Gunfire exploded over the radio, a terrifying cacophony of shots and panicked shouts. The feed from one of their primary camera positions went dead. "It's a setup," Russo roared, grabbing his weapon. "They knew we were here. They knew our positions. Abort! All teams, pull back! Abort mission. In the van, Arya watched in horror as the scene descended into a one-sided firefight. A flash of muzzle fire on screen was followed by a sickening thud against the side of their own van. They were being targeted. We're compromised. We have to go now, Russo yelled, shoving Arya towards the back of the van. But as he moved towards the driver's seat, the passenger side window exploded inward in a shower of glass. Russo cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and crumpled to the floor, clutching his shoulder. A dark red stain was already spreading across his cheap suit jacket. The driver of the van, a young agent from the Quantico team, slammed the vehicle into gear and hit the accelerator, careening away from the firefight as bullets stitched a path across their rear doors. The chaotic retreat was a blur of swerving turns and panicked radio calls. Arya knelt beside Russo, pressing a trauma dressing against his bleeding shoulder, her hands slick with his blood. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion and terror. How could this have happened? Only 3 people knew the operational details: her, Russo, and David Chen. The leak had to have come from the top. Hours later, in the sterile, quiet hallway of a secure hospital wing, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a hollow, aching dread. Russo was in surgery, his condition critical but stable. Arya sat on a hard plastic chair, the metallic smell of blood still clinging to her clothes. David Chen arrived, his face a mask of shock and concern. Arya, my God, what happened out there? It was a setup, David, she said, her voice numb. They knew exactly where we would be. They were waiting for us. Someone leaked the entire operational plan. That's impossible, he said, shaking his head. Only the 3 of us knew the specifics. Exactly, Arya replied, her gaze locking with his. The suspicion, once a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, was now a roaring certainty. His facade of concern faltered for just a second. A flicker of something else, fear, guilt, in his eyes. We'll find the leak, he promised, his voice strained. I'll lock down everything. No one gets in or out of the Midas files without my direct authorization. Arya just stared at him, her silence a heavy accusation. When she finally got back to her temporary office in the early hours of the morning, exhausted and emotionally shattered, she couldn't rest. The image of David's fleeting expression haunted her. On a desperate hunch, she logged into the secure network, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She pulled up the system's deep audit logs, a level of access she wasn't supposed to have, but had been granted by a paranoid tech agent years ago. She searched for all external communications from David Chen's terminal over the past 48 hours. There were dozens of emails, all routine. But then she saw it. One entry that wasn't an email. It was a data transfer, a small encrypted file sent just hours before the raid. The file was disguised as a personal finance document. The recipient wasn't a name. It was a string of numbers. A routing number for an untraceable, anonymous digital Dropbox. A dead end. Except it wasn't. Arya's mind flashed back to the anonymous email she had received after the break-in. The stop wasn't a warning. It was a test. She had saved the email's raw header data, a long shot at tracing it. With trembling hands, she pulled up the header data and compared the routing information. They were a perfect match. The person who had sent her the warning, the person who had orchestrated the raid, the person who had just nearly killed Frank Russo and her entire team, wasn't some shadowy Midas operative. The leak wasn't just in the U.S. Attorney's office. The leak was the U.S. Attorney's office. The traitor was her boss, David Chen. The revelation struck Arya with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. David Chen, the man who had been her mentor, her advocate, the one who had reluctantly greenlit this very investigation, was the source of the leak. Every step she had taken, he had been one step ahead, not guiding her, but steering her into a cage. The concern, the shared strategy sessions, the feigned shock, it was all a masterful performance. A profound, soul-crushing despair settled over her. She was utterly and completely alone. The system she had devoted her life to, the very institution she represented, was not just flawed. It was compromised at its head. There was no one to report to, no one to trust. Reporting her discovery would be her word against a respected, long-serving U.S. attorney. He would bury her in bureaucratic red tape, discredit her as a hysterical subordinate who had botched a major operation. He would control the narrative. The ringing of her office phone made her jump. It was the front desk. AUSA Thompson, Mr. Chen has summoned you to his office. He said it's urgent. The calm, professional tone of the summons sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. It was happening already. He was moving to neutralize her. Walking down the hall to his office felt like walking to her own execution. When she entered, David wasn't alone. Two stern-faced men in dark suits from the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility stood beside his desk. "Arya," David began, his voice laced with a synthetic, sorrowful tone. "In light of last night's catastrophic failure, the DOJ is taking over. Agent Russo's operation was unsanctioned. He acted on poor intelligence, and your endorsement of his reckless plan led to this disaster." Arya stared at him, speechless. He was twisting the narrative with breathtaking audacity. "Agent Russo is a decorated veteran," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "He's an old-school cop who got sloppy," one of the DOJ men said dismissively. "The preliminary report suggests he was running a rogue op." "That's a lie," Arya shot back. "David, you authorized it. You requisitioned the team." David shook his head slowly, his face a mask of disappointment. "I authorized you to work with him on a preliminary inquiry. I never approved a full-scale armed raid on a civilian facility. Your ambition got the better of you, Arya. You pushed him too far." He slid a folder across the desk. "Effective immediately, you are on administrative leave, pending a full review of your conduct. You are to have no contact with anyone involved in the Midas case. Surrender your badge and credentials." It was a perfect checkmate. He had used her own drive against her, painting her as an overzealous prosecutor and Frank as a washed-up cowboy. In one move, he had discredited them both, isolated her, and seized control of the entire investigation. Defeated, she placed her badge on his desk. The weight of it felt immense as she let it go. As she turned to leave, her eyes met David's. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped, and she saw not malice, but a desperate, haunted look. It wasn't the look of a triumphant villain. It was the look of a man trapped in a cage of his own making. But it didn't matter. The result was the same. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, wandering the city streets. She was officially a pariah. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear. But she couldn't. Not while Frank was lying in a hospital bed because of her. That evening, she went to the hospital. A U.S. Marshal was posted outside Frank's room, standard procedure, for an agent injured in the line of duty. She expected to be turned away, but the marshal, a young woman with kind eyes, recognized her and simply nodded her through. Frank was awake, a web of tubes and wires connecting him to a symphony of beeping machines. His arm was in a heavy sling, and his face was pale, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Heard they put you on ice," he rasped, his voice weak. Arya sank into the chair beside his bed, the fight draining out of her. "They're blaming us, Frank. They're calling it a rogue operation. They're burying it." "Of course they are," he said, a grimace of pain crossing his face as he shifted slightly. "It's what the system does. It protects itself." He motioned with his good hand towards the small bedside table. "My wallet." "Get it." Confused, Arya retrieved his worn leather wallet. "Inside pocket," he instructed. "There's a key." She found a small, nondescript brass key. "Locker 3B. Bus station downtown," he said, his breathing shallow. "Go now, before they clear out my personal effects." He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "When the system is broken, you don't play by its rules anymore. You make your own." Arya's heart pounded. She pocketed the key, a new, desperate hope igniting within her. As she stood to leave, Frank grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Arya," he said, his gaze intense. "The ledger. The torn page. What about it?" "It wasn't just a name," he wheezed, the effort costing him. "I saw more than I told you. It was a list. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. Didn't want to spook you." "A list of who?" He reached for a notepad and pen on the table, his hand shaking badly. He scribbled something, then folded the paper and pushed it into her hand. "The kid, Riley." He didn't just see the page. Before Miller tore it out, he took a picture of it with his phone. He was too scared to give it to me then. He sent it to me right before the raid, said his conscience was killing him. Arya's fingers trembled as she unfolded the small piece of paper. On it, Frank had written a web address, a link to a secure, anonymous image hosting site. "The picture is there," Frank whispered, his eyes closing from exhaustion. "Chen's name is on it. But he's not at the top, kid. He's not even close." A sense of vertigo washed over Arya. David Chen, the man who held her career in his hands, was just another pawn. She stared at the folded piece of paper, the key to the locker digging into her palm. The abyss of despair was still there. But now, at the very bottom, a narrow, treacherous path had just appeared. It was a path that led outside the law, outside the system, and into a darkness deeper than she had ever imagined, and she knew she had no choice but to take it. The downtown bus station was a river of human transience, a place where people arrived with hope and left with resignation. It was the perfect place to be invisible. Arya, wearing a nondescript hoodie and a baseball cap, pulled low, moved through the crowd like a ghost. The brass key felt heavy in her pocket, a talisman from a world that no longer existed. Locker 3B was in a dimly lit, forgotten corner of the terminal. It opened with a rusty groan. Inside was a single item, a beat-up burner flip phone, the kind favored by criminals and spies. There was no charger, no box, just the phone. Arya took it and blended back into the anonymous flow of the station. She found a secluded bench in a small city park and powered it on. The battery was nearly full. There was only one contact stored in its memory, listed under a single cryptic name, Helios. Arya hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. The phone on the other end rang twice before a voice answered. It was digitally distorted, a synthesized, androgynous hum that was impossible to trace or identify. "Russo?" the voice asked. "No," Arya said, her own voice quiet. "He sent me." There was a long pause. Arya could hear the faint click and whir of what sounded like a server farm in the background. His key, his phone. The debt is his to call in. "What do you need?" The voice was cold, transactional. This wasn't an ally motivated by justice. This was a professional service being rendered. "I need information," Arya said, "and I need to be a ghost." "Anonymity is a commodity. Information is power," Helios replied. "Both have a price. Russo's credit covers the first consultation. Show me what you have." Arya read the web address Frank had scribbled on the note. "One moment," Helios said. The silence stretched on. Arya watched a group of pigeons fighting over a discarded piece of bread, her own world feeling just as precarious. "The image is authentic," Helios's voice returned, devoid of emotion. "High-resolution photo of a handwritten ledger page. I'm running a forensic handwriting analysis against known samples of Officer Miller's reports. It's a match. This is legitimate." "The list," Arya said, her voice tight. "Can you identify the names?" "Most are low-level. City council members, zoning officials, a few more officers from the 12th. But the top of the list is where it gets interesting." The synthesized voice read them off like a grocery list. Officer Mark Miller. Defense Attorney Benjamin Carter. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen. Hearing it confirmed sent another chill down Arya's spine. And above them, she pushed. "The Honorable Judge Marcus Reynolds, United States District Court," Helios stated. "He's the presiding judge on a major federal racketeering case. Code name, Operation Midas." The final, devastating piece of the puzzle slotted into place. Judge Reynolds. The man holding the scales of justice in her case was the one who had his thumb pressing down on them. Every warrant she filed, every motion she argued, went through him. The entire investigation was a sham, a theatrical performance for a judge who was already on the other side. "There's more," Helios continued. "I've been monitoring dark web chatter around the Midas organization for months. They're notoriously disciplined. The leak from your office about the raid, it doesn't fit their profile. They don't take risks like that unless they're forced to." "What are you saying?" Arya asked. "I'm saying your boss, David Chen, might not be the villain you think he is. A man in his position doesn't turn traitor overnight. There's usually a catalyst, a point of leverage. Give me his name, and I'll find it." Arya gave him the name, her heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and a desperate, flickering hope. For the next hour, she sat on the park bench as Helios worked, a silent partner on the other end of the line. The digital ghost in the machine sifted through the vast, hidden architecture of David Chen's life financial records, encrypted communications, travel manifests, medical histories. "Found it," Helios said suddenly. 2 months ago, Chen's daughter, a university student, was scheduled to fly to London for a semester abroad. She never got on the plane. There's no record of her anywhere after her airport check-in. No social media posts, no credit card activity, no contact with friends. She vanished. Arya felt sick. They have her. Midas has his daughter. "It appears so," Helios confirmed. "Chen isn't a traitor, Miss Thompson. He's a hostage. Every move he's made against you was likely under duress, to protect his child. He's not their partner, he's their puppet. The revelation reframed everything. David wasn't a monster. He was a father backed into an impossible corner, forced to sacrifice his protege to save his child. The haunted look she'd seen in his eyes wasn't guilt, it was agony. "This is bigger than a list of corrupt officials," Arya said, her mind racing. A new, audacious strategy beginning to form. Who are they? Who is Midas? Who has the power to kidnap a federal prosecutor's daughter and make a federal judge their pawn? "That is the billion-dollar question," Helios said. "Their operational security is flawless. Their leader is a phantom. They move money through layers of shell corporations, so complex it would take years to unravel. You can do it in hours," Arya stated. It wasn't a question. A faint, almost imperceptible digital chuckle came through the phone. "My services come at a cost." "I don't have money," Arya said. "But I have something better. I have the power to burn their entire network to the ground. If you give me the head of the snake, I can give you a world of chaos for them to drown in. I can make their most confidential information public record." "An intriguing offer," Helios mused. "Disruption for data. I accept." For the rest of the night, Arya sat in the growing darkness of the park, the burner phone pressed to her ear, a silent two-person conspiracy against a vast and powerful empire. Helios, with the surgical precision of a master hacker, began to peel back the layers of the Midas organization. He followed the money not through bank records, but through cryptocurrency tumblers and transactions on the hidden stock markets of the dark web. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, Helios spoke. "I have him." "Who is it?" Arya breathed. "The money trail doesn't end at a cartel boss or a mobster. It ends in the legitimate world. It ends at the central server for Sterling Enterprises." Arya's blood ran cold. Sterling Enterprises was one of the largest and most respected private equity firms in the country. "What? That's impossible." "The numbers don't lie," Helios said. "The profits from Midas's illicit activities are being funneled, washed, and reinvested to manipulate global financial markets on a massive scale. Operation Midas isn't just a drug and racketeering case. That's the tip of the iceberg. The real crime is market manipulation that makes billions." "So who's the head?" Arya demanded. "Who is Midas?" "There is no Midas," Helios replied, and the synthesized voice delivered the final, stunning blow. "The man giving the orders, the man pulling the strings of judges and prosecutors, the man at the absolute top of this empire is its founder and CEO. The philanthropist, the market genius, the man on the cover of Forbes last month." The voice paused, letting the weight of the name settle. "Jonathan Sterling. Jonathan Sterling." The name echoed in the silence of the park, a name synonymous with innovation, wealth, and public adoration. He wasn't just a criminal. He was an untouchable titan of industry. The system wasn't just compromised by him, it was practically owned by him. To go after Sterling directly through official channels would be suicide. His army of lawyers would bury Arya in motions. His political connections would shut down any investigation, and his control over Judge Reynolds meant no warrant would ever be signed. Arya knew then that she couldn't win by playing by the rules of a game that Sterling had rigged. She had to kick over the entire chessboard. "Helios," she said into the burner phone, her voice a low, steady hum of newfound purpose. "I'm no longer a prosecutor. I'm a strategist, and we are going to war." For the next 24 hours, from a cheap, anonymous motel room paid for in cash, Arya and her digital ghost planned their assault. It was a desperate, three-pronged attack, designed to dismantle Sterling's empire from the inside out, using his own weapons, leverage, chaos, and betrayal against him. Phase 1. Freeing the hostage. Sterling's power over Chen is his daughter, Arya strategized. We take that away, we get Chen back on our side. Helios, with unsettling speed, burrowed into the digital infrastructure of Sterling's personal security network. He found a weak point, a catering company that serviced a remote, heavily guarded estate Sterling owned in the Virginia countryside. By hacking the company's delivery schedule, Helios identified a window of opportunity. More importantly, he found thermal imaging data from a private satellite feed that showed a heat signature in a guest house on the property that was inconsistent with guards, a single, isolated person. Arya couldn't send the FBI or the local police. They could be compromised. But there was one agency renowned for its operational integrity and its jurisdiction above local politics, the U.S. Marshals. Using the burner phone, Arya placed an anonymous, untraceable call to the Marshal's Violent Fugitive Task Force. She didn't give her name. She simply provided the exact coordinates of the estate, the layout of the guest house, the number of guards, and the time of the next catering delivery. Federal prosecutor's daughter held hostage by a material witness in the Midas case, she said, her voice digitally altered by Helios. He's about to be silenced. You have a 2-hour window. She gave them just enough verifiable detail to force them to act, then disconnected. Phase 2. Sowing chaos. Sterling's network runs on fear and control, Arya explained to Helios. We need to make his own people doubt that control. Helios drafted a series of encrypted messages, perfectly mimicking the communication style of Sterling's top lieutenants. The first message, sent to Judge Reynolds, was a carefully worded warning that Officer Miller and his crew were getting nervous and were suspected of having made a deal with a rival organization. The second message, sent to Miller from a source appearing to be Reynolds, hinted that Sterling was planning to clean house and eliminate the street-level assets, including Miller, to cut all ties to the Midas case. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma, designed to turn the co-conspirators against each other. It would make them paranoid, unpredictable, and dangerous. Phase 3. The King's Confession. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. Arya had to get to Sterling himself. She sent a message directly to Jonathan Sterling, this time using Ben Carter's compromised lawyer credentials, which Helios had easily acquired. The message proposed a meeting. It claimed that a rogue prosecutor had a copy of the full ledger, including details of Sterling's market manipulation, and was threatening to release it. It offered Sterling a chance to buy the ledger and the prosecutor's silence. As bait, she attached a single, redacted page from Miller's ledger, a page showing a transaction that only Sterling would recognize. The location for the meeting: a vast, abandoned warehouse complex at the city's industrial edge. The time: midnight. Sterling, arrogant and convinced of his own invincibility, took the bait. The warehouse was a cavernous tomb of rust and decay. Arya stood in the center of the vast, dusty floor, a single bare bulb overhead casting long, dancing shadows. She wasn't wearing a wire. It was too risky. Instead, Helios had activated the microphones on a series of discarded security cameras scattered throughout the warehouse, feeding the audio directly to a secure, off-site server. Sterling arrived not with an army, but with a quiet, menacing confidence, flanked by only 2 bodyguards. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, and radiated an aura of absolute power. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I must admit I'm impressed. To have come this far all on your own. It's a shame you chose the wrong side." "There are no sides when the whole board is corrupt," Arya countered, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "There's only the truth, and I have it. The truth is a commodity, like any other," Sterling said with a dismissive wave, "and I am its highest bidder. So, name your price. The ledger, your silence. Everything is for sale." "My silence isn't," Arya said, "but I want to hear it from you. Why? You have everything. Money, power, respect. Why build an empire on drugs and fear?" Sterling laughed, a genuine mirthless sound that echoed in the cavernous space. "You see drugs and fear. I see market inefficiencies. The illicit drug trade is the purest form of capitalism on Earth, unregulated, untaxed, with infinite demand. I don't sell the product. I simply control the flow of its capital. That capital, in turn, allows me to shape the world, to create order from chaos. The people on my payroll, the cops, the judges, they aren't criminals. They are simply employees of a more efficient system. My system, it was the confession she needed. Every word was being recorded. Suddenly, the warehouse doors at the far end burst open. Headlights flooded the space, pinning them in their glare. It was Officer Miller and his crew, but they weren't looking at Arya. They were looking at Sterling, their faces a mixture of fear and rage. "Reynolds told us you were going to cut us loose," Miller yelled, his gun raised, "that you were going to clean house." Sterling's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury as he realized he'd been played. "You fool. He set you up. You set us up," Miller screamed. Before Sterling could respond, his own bodyguards drew their weapons, not to protect him, but to aim at Miller's crew. The trap had sprung on itself. The factions, poisoned by paranoia, were about to tear each other apart. It was in that impossibly tense standoff that the final player arrived. With a deafening crash, the massive roll-up doors on the side of the warehouse were smashed inward by an armored vehicle. Floodlights turned the night into day as a dozen figures in tactical gear swarmed into the warehouse from all sides, their weapons raised, red laser dots dancing across everyone's chests. U.S. Marshals, drop your weapons. Down on the ground. Now. The voice was amplified, authoritative, and absolute. This was the final part of Arya's plan, a failsafe she had communicated to Helios. Just as she had anonymously tipped off the marshals about Chen's daughter, she had sent a second tip regarding this warehouse. She had provided the time, location, and the names of the attendees, including a wanted fugitive and a high-value target, along with a snippet of the ledger proving a conspiracy was in motion. She gave them no choice but to intervene. For a moment, no one moved. Then, seeing the overwhelming force and precision of the marshals, Miller's crew dropped their guns. Sterling's bodyguards, after a brief hesitation, did the same. Jonathan Sterling stood alone in the center of it all, his perfect suit now covered in dust, his expression one of utter disbelief. He looked at Arya, his eyes finally understanding the depth of his miscalculation. She hadn't come to negotiate. She hadn't come to fight. She had come to burn it all down. The aftermath of the warehouse raid was not a celebration, but a quiet, methodical dismantling. Jonathan Sterling, Officer Miller, Judge Reynolds, and dozens of others across the city were taken into federal custody in a single coordinated sweep. The audio recording from the warehouse, coupled with the complete, unredacted ledger which Helios had anonymously delivered to the head of the U.S. Marshals, was irrefutable. The Midas Empire, once an untouchable shadow government, had crumbled overnight. David Chen's daughter was found safe in the Virginia estate, shaken but unharmed. In exchange for his full, public testimony against Sterling and the entire network, David was granted prosecutorial immunity. He resigned his position the next day, disappearing from public life, to heal his fractured family. Arya was reinstated, her name cleared, and her status elevated from suspended prosecutor to national hero. The media clamored for interviews. The DOJ offered her commendations. She was hailed as a giant slayer, a crusader who had single-handedly purged the city of its deepest corruption. But Arya felt none of it. There was no victory lap, no triumphant press conference. The weight of what she had done, the lines she had crossed, and the price that had been paid, settled on her not as a crown, but as a shroud. She had won, but she had been forced to become something other than a prosecutor to do it. She had used deceit, manipulation, and operated so far outside the law that she barely recognized the person who had stared back at her from the motel room mirror. A few weeks later, she visited Frank Russo at a rehabilitation facility. He was out of the hospital, his arm still in a sling, but the color had returned to his face. He sat in a wheelchair in a sunlit garden, looking out at the city skyline. "I read about you in the papers," he said, not looking at her. "They're calling you a hero." "They don't know the whole story," Arya replied, sitting on the bench beside him. "I do," he said, finally turning to face her. The old cynicism in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. "You did what no one else could. You didn't just enforce the law. You reminded the system what it's supposed to be for." He reached over with his good hand and placed something small and heavy in her palm. It was an old, slightly tarnished tie clip, shaped like a simple, balanced scale of justice. "My old partner gave that to me when I first made detective. Said it was to remind him what we were fighting for. I think you've earned it." Arya closed her hand around it, the cool metal, a comforting weight. "Thank you, Frank." They sat in silence for a long time, two survivors watching the city they had fought for. Months passed. The trials began. Arya, by choice, was not the lead prosecutor. She worked in the background, helping to build the cases, but she couldn't bring herself to stand in a courtroom and argue a case that had been won in the shadows. The glamour of the fight was gone, leaving only the quiet, tireless work of rebuilding. One morning, she stood before her own apartment mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse. She was preparing for a new case, a small-time fraud investigation that felt refreshingly, beautifully simple. Before she left, on impulse, she picked up Frank's tie clip. It wasn't meant for her attire, but she clipped it to the inside of her blazer, just over her heart, where no one could see it, but she could feel its presence. She looked at her reflection. She didn't see a hero. She didn't see a victim. She saw a guardian, a person who had walked through the deepest darkness of the system she loved and had chosen, against all odds, to drag it back toward the light. The scars of that journey would never fade, but they had forged her into something stronger, something more resilient. As she walked out the door, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown, encrypted number. The world is a quieter place now. My debt is paid. But should you ever need to balance the scales again? Helios is watching. The message vanished after she read it. Arya allowed herself a small, faint smile. She walked out into the morning sun, leaving the shadows behind. The war was over, but she knew the fight for justice was a campaign without end, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for the next battle. The stillness after the storm was not an ending. It was a new beginning.